My father-in-law claimed my baby as his heir until the DNA test came back. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a ticking bomb, the DNA lab's logo stark against crisp white paper. My hands shook as I stared at it, knowing that whatever was inside would either save my marriage or destroy what was left of my life. Open it, Sarah. My husband Michael's voice was hollow, exhausted from 3 weeks of hell that started the night his father made his announcement at the country club. I could still hear Richard Blackwood's booming voice echoing through the mahogany-paneled dining room. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my son, my biological son. He lifted my 3-month-old baby, James, high above his head like some twisted Lion King moment while 60 of the town's elite watched in stunned silence. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By morning, Richard had called his lawyer and changed his will, leaving his $40 million estate to his rightful heir. By afternoon, the whispers had started at the grocery store, the bank, the post office. By evening, my own husband was sleeping in the guest room, his eyes filled with doubt every time he looked at me. How could you even think I would do that? I'd screamed at Michael that first night. Sleep with your father? Are you insane? But Richard Blackwood was persuasive, and he'd been planning this for weeks. He had photos, doctored ones showing me and him at family gatherings, standing just a little too close. He had receipts for flowers and jewelry, claiming he'd been buying them for me during our affair. He even produced hotel records from the Fairmont downtown, insisting we'd met there every Tuesday for months. The timing matches, Michael had said quietly, his voice breaking. James was conceived right around when Dad says, when he says you too. I couldn't finish the sentence then, and I couldn't stomach hearing it now. The worst part wasn't even the accusations. It was watching my baby become a pawn in Richard's sick game. He'd hired a nanny without asking, had a nursery set up in his mansion, and started introducing himself as James's father to anyone who would listen. The man who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years of marriage suddenly couldn't get enough of his son. My mother-in-law Patricia had moved out within days, her 30-year marriage crumbling under the weight of her husband's claims. She wouldn't look at me anymore, wouldn't even say my name. The whole Blackwood family had fractured, and somehow I was both the cause and the victim. I know what this is going to say, I whispered, finally picking up the envelope. I know James is yours, Michael. I know I never touched your father. But what I don't understand is why Richard is doing this to us. Michael's jaw tightened. Money. Control. Power. Pick one, Dad's got plenty of all three. But as I slid my finger under the envelope seal, I had a horrible feeling this was about more than money. Richard Blackwood was methodical, calculated. Men like him didn't destroy their own families and reputations on a whim. There had to be something else, something bigger driving this madness. The paper crinkled as I unfolded it, my eyes scanning past the technical jargon to find the results that would determine my family's future. What I found there made my blood run cold, not because of what it proved, but because of what it revealed about the man we'd trusted with our lives. Michael, I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. We need to call the police. Michael's face went white as I handed him the DNA results. His eyes darted across the page, reading the same impossible truth I'd just discovered. This can't be right, he whispered. Dad isn't James's father, but he's also not. He's not my father either. The lab results were crystal clear. Richard Blackwood shared no genetic markers with either my son or my husband. 0. Which meant the man who'd raised Michael for 28 years, who'd walked him down the aisle at our wedding, who'd built a financial empire to pass down to his bloodline, wasn't related to any of us. There's more, I said, pulling out the second page I'd requested after Richard's accusations started. I had them run your DNA against James too, just to be absolutely certain. Michael's hands trembled as he read the confirmation that James was indeed his biological son. Relief should have flooded through us both, but instead, a darker realization was taking hold. If Dad knew he wasn't my real father, Michael said slowly, then claiming James was his biological son was never about the money. It was about having an actual heir, I finished. Someone with real Blackwood blood to leave his fortune to. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister-in-law Amanda, * emergency family meeting at Dad's house. 6 p.m. He says he has proof you've been lying, *. He's not backing down, I showed Michael the message. Even now, he's doubling down on this insanity. We drove to the Blackwood mansion in silence, the DNA results burning like evidence in my purse. The circular driveway was packed with cars, Amanda's BMW, Patricia's Mercedes, even Michael's Uncle Frank had driven down from Boston. Richard had assembled the entire extended family for what I could only assume would be my public execution. Inside, the living room felt like a courtroom. Richard sat in his leather wingback chair like a king on his throne, still wearing the same smug expression he'd worn at the country club 3 weeks ago. Patricia sat across the room, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She'd lost 20 pounds since moving out, and I felt a stab of guilt seeing how this had destroyed her too. Now that everyone's here, Richard announced, I want to address the rumors that have been circulating about the paternity test. They're not rumors, Dad. Michael stepped forward, pulling the papers from my purse. The results are right here. Richard's confidence faltered for just a moment before his lawyer's training kicked in. DNA tests can be manipulated, son. Sarah had 3 weeks to doctor those results. Then let's do another one, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Right now. Independent lab, we all go together. That won't be necessary. Richard stood, moving toward a manila envelope on the side table. Because I have security footage from the Fairmont Hotel that will prove everything I've been saying. Amanda gasped. Uncle Frank muttered something under his breath. But I felt oddly calm as Richard fumbled with his evidence. Because now I understood what was really happening. Go ahead, I said quietly. Show everyone your footage. Show them the receipts, the photos, all of it. But first, I want you to explain something to your family. Richard's eyes narrowed. I don't know what game you think you're playing. The same game you've been playing for 28 years. I pulled out the DNA results and held them up for everyone to see. The game where you pretend Michael is your biological son when you know damn well he isn't. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's sharp intake of breath. Amanda's confused what? Uncle Frank's slow, dawning comprehension. And Richard Blackwood's face, crumbling as his 30-year lie finally came to light. You're lying. Richard's voice cracked for the first time since I'd known him, the commanding baritone reduced to something desperate and hollow. Michael is my son. I raised him. You raised Patricia's son, I said, watching the color drain from every face in the room. But you're not his father. Just like you're not James's father. The DNA test proves it. Patricia stood up so fast her chair toppled backward. What are you saying? Richard, what is she saying? I looked at my mother-in-law, this broken woman who'd been destroyed by her husband's accusations against me, and felt my heart shatter for her. She'd been living a lie for nearly 3 decades, and she didn't even know it. The paternity test didn't just test James against Richard, I explained gently. I had them test Michael too. Richard Blackwood shares 0 genetic markers with either of them. That's impossible, Amanda whispered. Dad, tell them it's impossible. But Richard wasn't talking anymore. He'd sunk back into his chair, his face ashen, his hands gripping the armrests like anchors. The manila envelope with his evidence lay forgotten on the floor. Uncle Frank stepped forward, his lawyer's mind already working through the implications. Richard, if this is true, then everything you've done these past 3 weeks was fraud, Michael finished, his voice hollow with shock. Dad, you destroyed our family. You made everyone think Sarah cheated with you. You changed your will, hired a nanny for James, told the entire town you were his father. And you knew the whole time that you weren't even my biological father? Patricia was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. 28 years, she whispered. 28 years you let me believe. She turned to me suddenly, her eyes wild. Who? Sarah, if Richard isn't Michael's father, then who is? I had been dreading this question, but I'd known it was coming. The lab can only tell us who isn't the father. We'd need to test other potential candidates to find out who is. There's only one candidate, Patricia said, her voice getting stronger, angrier. She turned to face her husband with a fury I'd never seen before. Isn't there, Richard? Only one man it could be. Richard's silence was answer enough. Jesus Christ, Frank breathed. Patricia, are you saying? I'm saying Richard has known since the day Michael was born that he wasn't the father. And he's known exactly who was. Patricia's voice was like ice now. Haven't you, darling husband? The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Richard's obsession with bloodlines and genetic legacy. His sudden claim on James. The way he'd been so methodical in destroying my reputation instead of just quietly pursuing a paternity test. You weren't trying to claim James as your heir, I said slowly, the truth hitting me like a freight train. You were trying to claim him before his real grandfather could. Michael looked between his mother and the man he'd called father his whole life. Mom, who was my real father? Patricia wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she looked strong. Determined. Your father, she said clearly, is Judge William Harrison. Amanda gasped. Uncle Frank cursed under his breath. And I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized why Richard had been so desperate to claim James as his own. Judge William Harrison wasn't just any judge. He was the presiding judge over the county court system, Richard's biggest business rival, and the man who'd been investigating Blackwood Industries for tax fraud for the past 6 months. Richard, I whispered, what have you done? The room erupted into chaos as the implications of Patricia's revelation sank in. Amanda was shouting questions nobody could answer, Frank was on his phone frantically calling someone, and Richard just sat there like a broken marionette, staring at the DNA results that had destroyed his carefully constructed world. Judge Harrison, Michael repeated, testing the name on his tongue. The same Judge Harrison who's been investigating Dad's company? Patricia nodded, her jaw set with grim determination. The same Judge Harrison who signed a warrant to seize your father's financial records last month. The same man who's been building a case that could send Richard to prison for 20 years. Oh my God, I breathed, the full scope of Richard's manipulation finally becoming clear. You weren't just trying to steal James for the inheritance. You were trying to get leverage over Judge Harrison. Richard finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. William doesn't know. About Michael. He never knew Patricia was pregnant when she married me. Because you made sure he didn't know. Patricia's composure cracked, 30 years of buried resentment spilling out. You swooped in the moment you found out I was carrying another man's child. Convinced me William had abandoned me, that he was engaged to someone else. You said you'd give my baby a name, a future. I was 19 and terrified, Richard. I believed you were saving us. Michael sank onto the couch, his face pale. So you've known my entire life that Judge Harrison was my biological father, and you never said anything? Even when he started investigating your company? I couldn't risk it, Richard said, desperation creeping into his voice. Don't you see? If William found out about you, if he discovered I'd kept his son from him for 3 decades, he'd destroy everything I built. The investigation, the charges, none of it would matter. He'd make it personal. So instead you made my baby your weapon, I said, fury building in my chest. You figured if you could claim James as your biological son, you'd have Judge Harrison's grandson. Something to hold over him if the investigation got too close. Amanda was staring at her father in horror. Dad, please tell me you didn't plan this from the beginning. Please tell me you didn't wait for Sarah to have a baby just so you could. The timing was perfect, Richard admitted, and I felt sick. Sarah was pregnant, William was closing in on the company, and I needed insurance. If I could convince everyone that James was mine, that I was his grandfather through blood, then William would have to choose between his grandson and his crusade against me. You sick bastard, Michael stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. You were going to use our son to blackmail a federal judge? Do you have any idea what that makes you? Desperate, Richard said simply. Blackwood Industries employs 300 people in this county. My foundation funds the children's hospital, the library, half the scholarships at a community college. If William destroys me, he destroys all of that. If? Frank laughed bitterly from across the room. Richard, you just confessed to attempted extortion of a federal judge in front of 6 witnesses. William Harrison doesn't need to destroy you anymore. You've done it yourself. I pulled out my phone, my hands surprisingly steady. I'm calling Judge Harrison. He deserves to know he has a son and a grandson. Sarah, wait, Michael grabbed my arm. Are you sure about this? Once we make that call, there's no going back. My entire life, everything I thought I knew about my family, is already gone, I finished gently. Richard destroyed that the moment he decided to use James as leverage. But maybe you can have something real instead. A father who doesn't see you as a pawn in his games. Richard stood up shakily, aging 10 years before our eyes. If you make that call, if you tell William the truth, I'll lose everything. The company, the house, my reputation. You should have thought about that before you accused your daughter-in-law of sleeping with you, Patricia said coldly. Before you made our grandson the center of your twisted scheme. I dialed the number I'd looked up on the county website, my heart pounding as it rang once, twice. Harrison residence. Judge Harrison? This is Sarah Blackwood. I need to speak with you about a family matter. It's about my husband Michael, and... Well, sir, I think you might want to sit down for this. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought Judge Harrison had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled in that way only judges and lawyers manage when their world is collapsing. Mrs. Blackwood, I think you'd better come to my home. Tonight. And bring the DNA results. Judge William Harrison lived in a modest colonial on Elm Street, nothing like the Blackwood mansion with its sprawling grounds and circular driveway. When he opened the door, I saw immediately where Michael had gotten his dark eyes and the stubborn set of his jaw. The resemblance was so obvious now that I wondered how no one had ever noticed it before. Patricia, Judge Harrison breathed when he saw my mother-in-law. His composure cracked for just a moment. It's been 30 years. Hello, William. Patricia's voice was steady, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands. I'm sorry it took this long. We sat in his living room, Michael, Patricia, and me, while Judge Harrison read the DNA results 3 times. The walls were lined with law books and family photos, and I noticed several pictures of a woman who must have been his late wife. No children visible anywhere, which made sense now. He'd never known he had a son. 99.7% probability, he read aloud. Michael, you're really... Your son, Michael said quietly. Apparently I have been for 28 years. I just found out today. Judge Harrison set the papers down with shaking hands. Patricia, when you married Richard, you were, how far along? 2 months, she admitted. You'd left for that clerkship in Washington. Richard told me you were engaged to someone there, that you'd moved on. He said he'd take care of us, give the baby his name. I wrote you letters, Judge Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. Dozens of them. Asked you to come with me, told you I wanted to marry you when I got back. Did you ever receive them? Patricia's face went white. No. William, I never got any letters. Michael leaned forward. Dad, Richard, he intercepted them, didn't he? I pulled out my phone and showed them the recording app I'd started running before we left the mansion. He confessed to everything. The fake evidence about James, the real paternity results, even admitting he planned to use my son as leverage against Judge Harrison's investigation. That son of a bitch, Judge Harrison muttered, then immediately apologized. I'm sorry, 30 years of my son's life. 30 years, Patricia. There's more, I said reluctantly. Richard's been planning this for months. He has fake hotel records, doctored photos, forged receipts, enough manufactured evidence to convince a jury that I had an affair with him. If we hadn't demanded the DNA test, he would have gotten away with it, Michael finished. And eventually used James to pressure you into dropping the investigation. Judge Harrison stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. The Blackwood Industries case goes to grand jury next week. We have evidence of tax evasion, money laundering, possibly racketeering. Richard's looking at federal prison time. That's why he got desperate, Patricia said. William, he's not the man I married 30 years ago. The money, the power, it changed him. Made him paranoid, controlling. What he did to Sarah was unforgivable, Michael said, reaching for my hand. Making everyone in town think she'd sleep with her own father-in-law, destroying her reputation, traumatizing our family. All to cover up his own crimes. Judge Harrison turned from the window, and I saw steel in his expression. Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah, I need you to know that Richard's legal troubles won't disappear because of this revelation. If anything, attempting to extort a federal judge makes things worse for him. Good, I said firmly. He deserves whatever's coming. But, Judge Harrison continued, his voice softening as he looked at Michael, I want you both to know that I intend to be part of my grandson's life, if you'll let me. And Michael, son. I know this is overwhelming, but I'd like to try to build a relationship with you too. Michael's eyes filled with tears. I'd like that. I mean, after 28 years of Richard Blackwood as a father figure, I think I'm ready for someone who won't use my family as pawns in his schemes. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda, asterisk dad's having chest pains. Ambulance on the way. You broke him, asterisk. I showed the message to the others, feeling a mix of guilt and vindication. Karma, Patricia said simply. 30 years of lies finally catching up with him. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital felt surreal at 11 p.m., fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as we waited for news about Richard's condition. Amanda paced the waiting area like a caged animal, while Uncle Frank made hushed phone calls to other family members. Michael sat beside me, still processing the fact that he'd gained a biological father and lost the man who'd raised him in the span of 6 hours. Mrs. Blackwood? Dr. Martinez approached us, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Blackwood is stable. He suffered what we call a stress-induced cardiac episode, essentially a heart attack brought on by extreme emotional trauma. He's asking to see his family. Amanda rushed past us toward Richard's room, but I caught Michael's arm. You don't have to do this. Not after what he put us through. I know, Michael said quietly. But I need to hear him explain 30 years of lies. Richard looked smaller in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily. The man who'd commanded every room he entered for as long as I'd known him now seemed fragile, defeated. His eyes tracked to Michael first, then to me. I suppose you called the authorities, he said, his voice raspy from the oxygen mask. Not yet, I admitted. Though Judge Harrison made it clear that's happening regardless. Richard closed his eyes. William always was thorough. I should have known he'd figure it out eventually. Dad, Amanda said from the corner, please just tell us why. Why destroy our family like this? Why hurt Sarah and the baby? Richard was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The Henderson Foundation audit. Michael leaned forward. What about it? 6 months ago, they discovered irregularities in our charitable giving. $3 million missing from the Children's Hospital Fund. Richard's confession came out in broken pieces. I'd been using the foundation accounts as personal loans, planning to pay it back after the Morrison land deal closed. But William started investigating before I could replace the money. I felt sick. You stole from sick children? Borrowed, Richard corrected weakly. The Morrison property was going to net $15 million in profit. I just needed bridge financing, and the foundation accounts were sitting there. Jesus Christ, Richard, Frank exploded. You embezzled from a children's hospital and then tried to frame your daughter-in-law for adultery to cover it up. The plan was elegant, Richard said, and I heard a hint of his old arrogance creeping back. If I could establish paternity over James, William would have to recuse himself from any case involving his grandson's legal father. Buy me time to replace the missing funds before anyone noticed. Amanda stared at her father in horror. You were going to let everyone believe Sarah cheated with you for the rest of her life. Let people think she was that kind of person. Sacrifices had to be made, Richard said simply. That's when I snapped. Sacrifices? My reputation isn't your sacrifice to make. My marriage, my son's relationship with his father, Patricia's mental health, none of that was yours to gamble with. The heart monitor started beeping faster as Richard became agitated. You don't understand the pressure I was under. 40 years building this company, this legacy. Hundreds of employees depending on me. The foundation funding half the community programs in this county. One audit anomaly and it all disappears. So you decided to disappear our lives instead, Michael said coldly. I was protecting the family business. Everything I built was for you, son. For your children. I'm not your son, Michael stood up abruptly. And James isn't your grandson. You made sure of that tonight. A knock at the door interrupted us. Judge Harrison stepped into the room, still wearing the same clothes from our earlier meeting. Behind him stood a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Agent Rebecca Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Mr. Blackwood, Agent Chen said formally, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted extortion of a federal official. You have the right to remain attorney. I know my rights, Richard interrupted, though his voice shook. Judge Harrison stepped closer to the bed, his expression unreadable. Richard, I've known you for 20 years. Tried cases in your office building, attended your charity galas, respected what I thought you stood for in this community. But what you did to this family, what you tried to do to my son and grandson, that's unforgivable. William, please. The foundation money, I can replace it. The Morrison deal closes next month, I can make this right. The Morrison deal was never going to close, Judge Harrison said quietly. The environmental impact study failed 3 weeks ago. The EPA rejected your permits on Tuesday. Richard's face went ashen. That's impossible. My lawyer said. Your lawyers have been lying to you, just like you've been lying to everyone else. Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs. Mr. Blackwood, we need to transport you to federal holding for processing. As they wheeled Richard out in restraints, Amanda broke down completely. Frank tried to comfort her while Patricia stared out the window at the parking lot. Michael pulled me close, and I realized we were finally free from Richard's manipulation. What happens now? I whispered. Judge Harrison smiled sadly. Now we figure out how to be a real family. The next morning brought a media circus I wasn't prepared for. By 7 a.m., 3 news vans were parked outside our house, and my phone had 17 missed calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten hold of the story. Prominent businessman arrested for embezzling children's hospital funds was the headline splashed across the County Herald's website, complete with a photo of Richard being wheeled out of the hospital in handcuffs. Michael made coffee with shaking hands while James babbled happily in his high chair, blissfully unaware that his grandfather's arrest was the talk of 3 counties. I was scrolling through increasingly frantic texts from friends and neighbors when Amanda called. Sarah, we have a problem, she said without preamble. Dad's lawyer is claiming the FBI coerced his confession. He's saying you and Judge Harrison conspired to frame him because of the investigation. I nearly dropped my phone. That's insane. We have recordings of him admitting everything. I know, but Marcus Webb is Dad's attorney, and he's never lost a federal case. He's already filed motions claiming judicial bias, saying Judge Harrison should have recused himself the moment he discovered Michael was his son. Michael looked up from his coffee. Can they really make that stick? Webb's arguing that Judge Harrison had personal motivations to destroy Dad's credibility, Amanda continued. He's saying the DNA test was manipulated, that you and William planned this whole thing to discredit the embezzlement charges. I felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Amanda, your father confessed to stealing $3 million from a children's hospital. How is Marcus Webb going to explain that away? He's claiming Dad was under extreme emotional duress when he made those statements. Says the shock of discovering Michael wasn't his biological son triggered a psychological break that made him say things that weren't true. Jesus, Michael muttered. Even from a hospital bed, he's still manipulating the situation. That afternoon, we met with Judge Harrison and Agent Chen at the federal building downtown. The FBI's conference room felt sterile and cold, nothing like the warm family meeting we'd had at Judge Harrison's house just 12 hours earlier. Webb's motion has some merit, Agent Chen admitted reluctantly. The defense can argue that Judge Harrison's personal connection to the case creates reasonable doubt about the integrity of the investigation. But Richard confessed, I protested. On recording. Multiple witnesses heard him admit to the embezzlement and the extortion plot. Confessions obtained under emotional duress can be challenged, Judge Harrison said quietly. Marcus Webb knows exactly what he's doing. He's going to argue that Richard was having a mental health crisis when he made those admissions. Agent Chen pulled out a thick file. We need to build our case on the financial evidence, not just the confession. The problem is, Richard was careful. The foundation money was moved through 6 different shell companies before ending up in his personal accounts. Without his admission of guilt, proving intent becomes much harder. Michael leaned forward. What about the fake evidence he created against Sarah? The hotel records, the doctored photos? All circumstantial unless we can prove he created them specifically to manipulate the investigation, Agent Chen replied. And Webb's already claiming those were created by someone else trying to frame his client. I felt like I was drowning. So Richard might actually get away with this? After everything he put our family through? Not if we can find the Morrison deal documents, Judge Harrison said suddenly. Sarah, when Richard mentioned the environmental study failure last night, he seemed genuinely shocked. If he was counting on that $15 million to replace the foundation money. Then somewhere there's a paper trail showing he knew the deal was dead weeks ago, Agent Shin finished, her eyes lighting up. Which would prove the foundation theft was never intended as a short-term loan. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, found something in Richard's home office. Can you meet me there in an hour, Patricia's at the mansion, I told the others. She says she found something. We drove to the Blackwood estate in Judge Harrison's car, avoiding the reporters still camped outside our house. The mansion felt different now, less imposing, more like a mausoleum of Richard's lies. Patricia met us at the front door, her face grim. I've been going through Richard's files, she said, leading us to his office. Look at this. She handed Judge Harrison a folder marked Morrison Environmental, Confidential. Inside were emails dating back 2 months, clearly showing that Richard's environmental consultants had warned him the EPA permits would be rejected. He knew, Judge Harrison breathed. He knew the Morrison deal was dead 8 weeks ago, which means when he stole the foundation money 6 months ago, he already suspected he might not be able to pay it back, Agent Shin finished. This isn't a desperate loan, this is premeditated theft. But as I read through the emails, my blood ran cold. The last message in the chain, dated just 3 days ago, wasn't about environmental permits at all. Patricia, I said slowly, look at this email from Marcus Webb. It's not about the Morrison deal. It's about something called Project Legacy. Patricia read over my shoulder, her face going white. Oh my God. Sarah, I think we just found out why Richard was really so desperate to claim James as his heir. The email from Marcus Webb was dated 3 days before Richard's hospital confession, but it read like a roadmap to something far more sinister than simple embezzlement. As I read the subject line, Project Legacy, Trust Structure and Beneficiary Documentation, my hands started shaking. Patricia, what is Project Legacy? I asked, though the growing pit in my stomach told me I didn't want to know the answer. She scrolled through more files on Richard's computer, her face getting paler by the minute. Oh God, it's a trust. A $20 million irrevocable trust that Richard set up 6 months ago. The same week he stole the foundation money. Judge Harrison leaned over her shoulder to read the screen. The beneficiary is listed as James Blackwood, biological heir of Richard Blackwood. The trust becomes active if Richard is convicted of any felony charges. Agent Chen was already on her phone, calling what sounded like a financial crime specialist. This changes everything, she said after hanging up. If Richard created this trust anticipating his arrest, then claiming James as his biological son wasn't just about manipulating the investigation, it was about hiding assets from federal seizure. Michael sank into Richard's leather chair, looking overwhelmed. You're saying Dad planned all of this? The embezzlement, framing Sarah, claiming James, it was all to protect his money? Not just protect it, I said, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. Transfer it. If James is legally recognized as Richard's biological heir, then even if Richard goes to prison, $20 million stays in the family through the trust. Patricia pulled up another document. There's more. The trust is managed by something called Cayman Heritage Holdings. Sarah, that's one of the shell companies the foundation money went through. Agent Chen cursed under her breath. He laundered stolen charity funds into an offshore trust, then tried to name your baby as the beneficiary. If this had worked, James would have inherited $3 million in stolen money, and Richard would have hidden another $17 million beyond federal reach. But the DNA test proves James isn't Richard's son, Judge Harrison pointed out. Doesn't that invalidate the trust? Only if we can prove Richard knew the paternity claim was false when he set it up, Agent Chen replied. Marcus Webb could argue that Richard genuinely believed he was James's father due to a delusional episode or mental illness. I felt sick. So even now, even after everything we've exposed, Richard might still get to keep the money? Patricia kept clicking through files, her jaw set with determination. Not if I can help it. She opened a folder labeled Insurance Policies and gasped. William, look at this. Richard took out a $5 million life insurance policy on James 3 weeks ago. The room went dead silent. Agent Chen slowly stood up, her professional composure cracking for the first time since I'd met her. He insured a 3-month-old baby for $5 million, she said quietly. The same week he hired a nanny and set up that nursery here at the mansion. Michael's voice was barely a whisper. He wasn't just trying to steal James's identity for the trust. He was. Jesus Christ, he was planning something else entirely. I grabbed the insurance documents with trembling hands. The policy was comprehensive, covering accidental death, illness, and kidnapping with a payout structure that seemed designed for immediate liquidation. The beneficiary was listed as the James Blackwood Legacy Trust, managed by Cayman Heritage Holdings. He was going to kill our baby, I breathed, the words barely making it past my lips. Richard was planning to murder James and collect $5 million in insurance money on top of the trust funds. Judge Harrison was already dialing 911. Agent Chen, we need to get protective custody for Sarah and James immediately. Richard might be in federal holding, but if he's desperate enough to plan something like this. He's got accomplices, Agent Chen finished grimly. The nanny he hired, the shell company managers, maybe even Marcus Webb. This isn't just embezzlement anymore, this is conspiracy to commit murder. As sirens wailed in the distance, I realized our nightmare was far from over. Richard Blackwood hadn't just tried to destroy our family's reputation, he'd been planning to destroy our family entirely. The safe house felt like a prison, even though I knew it was protecting us from something far worse. Agent Chen had moved us there within hours of discovering the insurance policy, and now James and I sat in a sterile government apartment while a team of U.S. Marshals stood guard outside. Michael paced by the window, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with his newly discovered father about Richard's expanding web of accomplices. They arrested the nanny, he said, hanging up and turning to face me. Caroline Morrison, turns out that wasn't even her real name. She's actually Caroline Webb, Marcus Webb's daughter. I felt the blood drain from my face. Richard's defense attorney planted his own daughter in our lives? How long was she working for him? According to Agent Chen, Caroline applied for the nanny position 2 weeks before Richard even announced his paternity claim at the country club. They've been planning this for months. James gurgled happily in my arms, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman I'd trusted to care for him had been part of a conspiracy to murder him. The thought made my stomach turn. Michael, she had access to our house. Our schedules. She knew when James napped, what he ate, his medical information. The FBI is analyzing everything she touched, Michael said, sitting beside me on the government-issued couch. His bottles, his toys, even his car seat. They're looking for anything that could have been used to make it look like an accident. My phone buzzed with a call from Patricia. She'd been staying at Amanda's apartment since Richard's arrest, trying to piece together 30 years of lies while helping the FBI untangle his financial schemes. Sarah, we found the Morrison connection, she said without preamble. The environmental consultant Richard hired wasn't just telling him the EPA permits would be rejected. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was telling him about her brother. Her brother? Daniel Morrison. The land developer Richard was supposedly partnering with on the $15 million deal. Sarah, Daniel Morrison died in a car accident 3 months ago. There never was a Morrison deal. Richard made the whole thing up to explain where the missing foundation money went. I put the phone on speaker so Michael could hear. You're saying Richard created a fake business partnership with a dead man? It gets worse, Patricia continued. We found emails between Richard and Caroline Webb dating back 6 months. She wasn't just posing as a nanny, she was documenting James's routines for what they called the incident. They have detailed notes about his feeding schedule, his sleep patterns, even which playground equipment he liked at the park. Michael stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. They were planning the murder for 6 months. Before James was even born, they were figuring out how to kill him. Agent Chen knocked and entered the apartment, her face grim. We've got a problem. Marcus Webb posted bail for his client an hour ago. Richard's out of jail? I clutched James tighter, my heart pounding. How is that possible? Webb convinced a judge that his client was no flight risk due to his medical condition and community ties. Richard's been released to house arrest with an ankle monitor, pending trial. House arrest at the same mansion where he set up a nursery for my son, I said, feeling panic rise in my throat. The same house where he planned to murder James. There's more, Agent Chen continued. We intercepted communications between Webb and someone using an encrypted messaging app. The conversation happened 20 minutes after Richard's release. Someone's planning to move forward with the legacy project whether Richard's in custody or not. Michael grabbed his jacket. We need to get to Judge Harrison. If there are other people involved in this conspiracy. Already on it, Agent Chen said. But here's what's concerning me, the encrypted messages reference something called Plan B. Whatever they were originally planning with James, they've got a backup strategy. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of backup strategy? We don't know yet, but one of the messages mentioned the grandfather angle and leveraging the biological connection. Sarah, I think they're going to try to use Judge Harrison's relationship with Michael and James to manipulate the investigation. My phone rang again, this time showing Judge Harrison's number. Michael answered it immediately. William, thank God. Are you safe? Judge Harrison's voice sounded strained. Son, I need you to listen carefully. I just received a call from someone claiming to represent Richard. They say they have evidence that could destroy my career and my relationship with you and James. They want to meet tonight to discuss terms. It's a trap, Agent Chen said immediately. Don't agree to anything. They're not giving me a choice, Judge Harrison replied. They said if I don't show up alone at the old Blackwood Industries warehouse at midnight, they'll release documents proving I've been manipulating the investigation to protect my newfound family. I looked at Agent Chen, seeing my own fear reflected in her eyes. Richard and his accomplices weren't just planning to murder James for insurance money anymore. They were going to use Judge Harrison's love for his son and grandson to destroy him professionally, clearing the way for Richard's charges to be dismissed. We're not letting you go alone, Michael said firmly. You might not have a choice, Judge Harrison replied quietly. Because they also said if anyone else shows up, their first target won't be me. It'll be James. The warehouse district felt like a graveyard at 11:30 p.m., empty buildings casting long shadows under flickering streetlights. Despite Agent Chen's protests, we'd convinced her to let us position ourselves around the old Blackwood Industries facility while Judge Harrison went inside alone. The FBI had surveillance equipment trained on every entrance, but I still felt sick knowing the man Michael had just found was walking into what could be an execution. Radio check, Agent Chen's voice crackled through our earpieces. Judge Harrison, you're clear to approach the building. Sarah and Michael, stay in position behind the loading dock. Do not move until I give the all clear. Through the warehouse's grimy windows, I could see a single light burning in what used to be Richard's executive conference room. Judge Harrison walked through the main entrance at exactly midnight, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness beyond. He's inside, Michael whispered beside me, his hands clenched into fists. God, what if this is exactly what they wanted? What if separating him from us was the whole point? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, asterisk check the news. Your baby story just got very interesting, asterisk. With shaking fingers, I pulled up the County Herald's website. The headline made my blood run cold, Federal Judge's secret son investigated for child endangerment, exclusive photos show neglect. The article was filled with fabricated stories and doctored images showing James in supposedly dangerous situations, near broken playground equipment, in an unsecured car seat, with what appeared to be prescription medications within reach. The photos were expertly manipulated, but anyone who didn't know the truth would see clear evidence of parental neglect. They're trying to build a case for emergency custody removal, I breathed, scrolling through the damning fake evidence. Michael, look at the timestamp, this article was published 20 minutes ago, right when Judge Harrison entered the warehouse. Agent Chen's voice came through the earpiece, tied with urgency. We've got multiple vehicles approaching from the east. 3 black SUVs, moving fast toward your position. The meeting was a diversion, Michael realized, grabbing my arm. They never intended to negotiate with Judge Harrison. They wanted him isolated while they moved on James. But James wasn't with us, he was back at the safe house with 2 other marshals. At least, I hoped he still was. Chen, we need immediate contact with the safe house, I said into my radio. If this is a coordinated attack. Safe house is not responding, came her grim reply. All units, we have a potential hostage situation at both locations. Warehouse team, maintain position on Judge Harrison. Mobile units, converge on the federal safe house immediately. The SUV screeched to a halt in the warehouse parking lot, disgorging 6 figures in dark clothing. I recognized Marcus Webb immediately, but the others were strangers, professional-looking men who moved with military precision. Sarah, Michael whispered urgently, one of them is carrying bolt cutters. They're not here to negotiate. Through the warehouse windows, I saw Judge Harrison standing across a conference table from someone I couldn't quite make out in the shadows. The conversation appeared heated, with Judge Harrison gesturing emphatically while his mysterious contact remained perfectly still. Then the lights went out. All units, we've lost visual contact, Agent Chen's voice crackled with static. Judge Harrison, respond immediately. Gunshots echoed from inside the warehouse, 3 quick bursts that sent birds scattering from nearby rooftops. Michael started to run toward the building, but I grabbed him back just as one of Webb's men rounded the corner, scanning our hiding spot with what looked like night vision equipment. They knew we'd be here, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. They planned for FBI surveillance. Michael, this whole thing is a setup to get Judge Harrison, us, and James all in one coordinated strike. My phone buzzed again, * warehouse basement. Come alone or the judge dies. You have 5 minutes, *. The message was signed with a single initial, R. Richard Blackwood was supposed to be under house arrest, but somehow he was here, orchestrating what appeared to be the final phase of his twisted legacy project. He's going to kill all of us tonight, I realized with horrible clarity. Judge Harrison for the investigation, us for exposing his lies, and James because dead heirs can't contest trust funds. Agent Chen's voice cut through the static, safe house is secure, repeat, safe house is secure. But we've lost all contact with the warehouse team. Sarah, Michael, you need to evacuate immediately. But as we turned to run, Marcus Webb stepped out of the shadows behind us, a gun pointed directly at my chest. Mrs. Blackwood, he said calmly, my client would like to have a word with you about his grandson's future. The basement of the Blackwood Industries warehouse smelled like rust and decades of industrial chemicals. Marcus Webb had marched us down at gunpoint while his associates secured the perimeter above. Judge Harrison sat zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the concrete room, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye. Behind him, emerging from the shadows like some twisted patriarch, stood Richard Blackwood. The ankle monitor was surprisingly easy to disable, Richard said conversationally, as if we were meeting for Sunday dinner instead of what was clearly going to be an execution. $1,400 to a hacker in Baltimore. Small price to pay for freedom. Richard, this is insane, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You're already facing federal charges. Kidnapping a judge and threatening us is only going to make things worse. Richard laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. Worse? Sarah, I'm 67 years old and looking at 25 years in federal prison. There is no worse. There's only salvage. Judge Harrison lifted his head, his voice hoarse but defiant. Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, Richard, it ends tonight. The FBI has enough evidence to convict you 10 times over. Evidence obtained through an investigation led by a biased judge who just discovered he had personal stake in my destruction, Marcus Webb interjected smoothly. Evidence that will be thrown out when the appeals court learns about your conflict of interest, William. Michael stepped protectively in front of me. What do you want? Money? We can transfer whatever accounts you need, pay back the foundation, make this right without anyone else getting hurt. Make this right? Richard's composure cracked slightly. You destroyed 40 years of careful planning in a single evening. The Morrison Trust, the legacy fund, the insurance policies, all worthless because you couldn't leave well enough alone. I realized he was talking about something beyond the foundation embezzlement. The Morrison Trust wasn't just about hiding stolen money, was it? You've been planning this financial shell game for decades. Richard's smile was cold. The Blackwood Industries pension fund holds $63 million in employee retirement money. Money that's been invested in very aggressive, very risky offshore ventures for the past 5 years. Money that's currently showing a $12 million deficit. The blood drained from Michael's face. Dad, you didn't. Tell me you didn't gamble with 300 people's retirement savings. I invested it, Richard corrected. Unfortunately, the cryptocurrency market proved less stable than projected. But the James Trust would have provided enough liquidity to cover the pension shortfall until the offshore accounts recovered. Judge Harrison struggled against his restraints. You were going to use blood money from your grandson's insurance policy to cover up stealing from your employees' pensions? Richard, how many people were you planning to destroy? As few as necessary, Richard said simply. The insurance payout would have been ruled accidental death. Tragic, but these things happen with infants. SIDS, choking hazards, household accidents. Caroline had it planned down to the minute. My stomach lurched as the full scope of his plan became clear. You weren't just going to murder James. You were going to make it look like we were negligent parents. The fake photos in that news article tonight, you were building a case that we were unfit, so when James died, nobody would look too closely at the circumstances. Grief-stricken parents make mistakes, Marcus Webb added clinically. Leave medication within reach, forget to secure a car seat properly. Very believable, very tragic, and absolutely untraceable back to my client. Michael was shaking with rage. You sick bastards. All of this, destroying Sarah's reputation, manipulating our marriage, terrorizing our family, it was all so you could steal pension money and cover it up with our son's murder. Richard checked his watch. This has been illuminating, but we're on a schedule. Caroline should be arriving at the safe house in approximately 15 minutes with the necessary documentation to assume emergency custody of James. A tragic gas leak will unfortunately claim the lives of his current guardians, leaving him in the care of his loving grandfather's estate. The FBI will never fall for that, I said desperately. The FBI will find 3 bodies in a warehouse and evidence of a murder-suicide pact between a corrupt judge and his co-conspirators, Webb replied matter-of-factly. Very sad. Very final. As Richard pulled a gun from his jacket, I realized we had run out of time, options, and miracles. But then Judge Harrison smiled, blood still running down his face. Richard, there's something you should know about that pension fund deficit you're so worried about. The time for negotiation is over, William. It was never deficit spending, Judge Harrison continued calmly. It was bait. The basement fell silent except for the steady drip of water from a broken pipe somewhere in the darkness. Richard's gun wavered slightly as he processed Judge Harrison's words. What are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Judge Harrison's smile widened despite the blood on his face. The pension fund investigation started 8 months ago, Richard. Long before you stole the foundation money. The FBI has been monitoring every offshore account, every cryptocurrency transaction, every shell company transfer you've made for the past year. Marcus Webb stepped closer to his client, alarm creeping into his professional demeanor. Richard, what is he talking about? The Morrison environmental contract, the Cayman Heritage Holdings, even Caroline's fake credentials, Judge Harrison continued methodically. We've been documenting everything. Did you really think a federal investigation would miss $63 million in pension fraud? Richard's face went ashen. That's impossible. My accountants assured me the offshore transfers were completely clean. Your accountants have been reporting to Agent Shin since March, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. Richard, you weren't staying one step ahead of the investigation. You were being led exactly where they wanted you to go. Michael looked between Judge Harrison and me in confusion. Wait, you're saying the FBI knew about all of this? The embezzlement, the trust funds, even the plot against James? Not the murder conspiracy, Judge Harrison admitted grimly. That was a horrifying surprise. But the financial crimes? Richard, every move you made to cover your tracks just dug you deeper into federal surveillance. Webb was frantically typing on his phone, his earlier composure completely shattered. The encrypted communications app we used to coordinate tonight. Richard, if they've been monitoring your accounts. They've been monitoring everything, Agent Chen's voice echoed from the stairwell above us. FBI. Everyone on the ground, now. The basement erupted into chaos as tactical flashlights blazed through the darkness. Richard spun toward the stairs, his gun swinging wildly between Judge Harrison and the approaching agents. Webb dropped his phone and dove behind a concrete pillar. Michael tackled me to the ground just as the first gunshot rang out, the bullet sparking off the metal beam inches from where I'd been standing. Sarah, stay down. Agent Shin shouted over the sound of boots thundering down the stairs. Richard Blackwood, drop your weapon. But Richard wasn't done fighting. 40 years, he screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. 40 years building this empire, and you're going to destroy it for what? 300 factory workers will be dead in 20 years anyway? For our son, Judge Harrison said quietly, his words cutting through Richard's hysteria. For James. For the family you tried to murder to cover up your greed. Richard's gun turned toward Judge Harrison with deadly precision. If I can't have my legacy, William, then you can't have yours either. Time slowed to a crawl. I saw Richard's finger tighten on the trigger. Saw Judge Harrison close his eyes, still smiling peacefully. Saw Michael lunge forward, shouting something I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. But when the smoke cleared, it was Marcus Webb lying motionless on the concrete floor, his own weapon still smoking in his hand. Above us, Agent Shin lowered her rifle, her face pale but determined. Richard Blackwood, she said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, pension fraud, and about 15 other federal crimes we'll discuss downtown. As the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, he looked directly at me with eyes full of pure hatred. This isn't over, Sarah. Even from prison, I can still destroy everything you care about. But for the first time in weeks, his threats felt hollow. The man who terrorized our family was finally powerless, and James was safe. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as Richard's trial began 3 weeks later. I sat in the gallery next to Michael and Judge Harrison, watching the man who'd terrorized our family shuffle into the defendant's chair in an orange jumpsuit. The past month had been a whirlwind of depositions, evidence gathering, and media interviews, but finally we were here, ready to see justice served. The prosecution calls Sarah Blackwood to the stand, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez announced. My legs felt unsteady as I walked to the witness box, hyper-aware of Richard's cold stare boring into me from across the courtroom. The replacement defense attorney, Marcus Webb, obviously couldn't represent his client from a federal medical facility, was a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Cross who'd already made it clear she intended to paint me as a manipulative opportunist who'd orchestrated Richard's downfall. Mrs. Blackwood, Martinez began gently, can you tell the court when you first became aware that Richard Blackwood was claiming to be your son's biological father? October 15th, at the Riverside Country Club, I answered, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He announced it publicly during a charity dinner, in front of approximately 60 community leaders. And what was your reaction to this announcement? Shock. Horror. I knew it was completely impossible because I'd never had any intimate contact with my father-in-law. Ever. Victoria Cross objected immediately. Leading the witness, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Richard's fake business partner, replied curtly. Martinez continued methodically, walking me through Richard's escalating campaign of manipulation. The doctored photos, the fake hotel receipts, the manufactured evidence of an affair that never happened. But when she got to the insurance policy Richard had taken out on James, the courtroom fell completely silent. $5 million, I repeated, the number still making me sick. He insured my 3-month-old baby for $5 million without our knowledge or consent. And based on the FBI's investigation, what was Mr. Blackwood's intended use for this insurance policy? Cross shot to her feet. Objection. Calls for speculation about my client's mental state. Your Honor, Martinez replied smoothly, Mrs. Blackwood is testifying about evidence discovered during the federal investigation, not speculating about the defendant's psychology. Overruled. The witness may answer. I took a deep breath, looking directly at the jury. The FBI found detailed plans showing that Richard intended to murder my son and claim the insurance money to cover up his theft of $63 million in employee pension funds. A woman in the jury box gasped audibly. Richard's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands clench into fists under the defense table. Mrs. Blackwood, Martinez continued, did you ever agree to participate in any scheme to defraud the Blackwood Industries pension fund? Absolutely not. I didn't even know there was a pension fund deficit until the night we found Richard in the warehouse. Cross's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. She hammered away at my motives, suggesting I'd seduced Judge Harrison into manipulating the investigation to protect my marriage. She implied I'd manufactured evidence against Richard out of spite. She even suggested that Michael and I had conspired to frame Richard from the beginning, using our newborn son as a weapon against the family patriarch. Isn't it true, Mrs. Blackwood, that you were facing significant financial pressure when your son was born? Cross demanded. We had normal expenses for new parents, but nothing extraordinary. Nothing extraordinary? Yet you readily agreed to DNA testing when it served your purposes, and you immediately contacted Judge Harrison the moment you discovered he might be your husband's biological father. Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I felt anger flaring in my chest. Ms. Cross, your client tried to murder my baby to cover up stealing from 300 families' retirement savings. There was nothing convenient about any of this nightmare. Objection. Cross snapped. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the raw truth in my voice, and I could see several of them looking at Richard with undisguised disgust. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, Michael squeezed my hand reassuringly. You did great, he whispered. But as Richard's cold eyes followed me back to my seat, I knew this trial was far from over. Victoria Cross had something planned for her defense, and based on the confident smirk on her face, it was going to be explosive. Judge Harrison took the stand the next morning, and I could see the toll this entire ordeal had taken on him. The man who'd presided over countless cases with unwavering authority now looked older, more fragile, as he settled into the witness chair. Victoria Cross was practically vibrating with anticipation. Whatever she had planned, this was her moment. Judge Harrison, Martinez began, can you explain to the jury your relationship to the defendant prior to October 15th? Richard Blackwood was a respected member of our community. I'd known him professionally for 20 years. He was a frequent donor to various civic causes, and our paths crossed regularly through legal and business functions. And when did you first learn that Michael Blackwood might be your biological son? Judge Harrison's voice softened. The evening Sarah called me with the DNA results. Until that moment, I had no idea Patricia had been pregnant when she married Richard, or that Michael could possibly be my child. Martinez walked him through the timeline carefully, his relationship with Patricia 30 years ago, her sudden marriage to Richard, the decades of believing he'd been forgotten. When she got to the pension fund investigation, Judge Harrison's testimony became clinical, methodical. We'd been tracking irregular transfers from the Blackwood Industries retirement accounts since March. The investigation was completely separate from any personal matters involving my family. Did you ever use your position to influence the investigation against Mr. Blackwood? Absolutely not. In fact, once I discovered Michael was my son, I immediately disclosed the conflict of interest to the FBI and offered to recuse myself from any related proceedings. Cross's cross-examination started gently, almost sympathetically. Judge Harrison, discovering you had a son and grandson must have been overwhelming. It was life-changing, yes. And you'd want to protect them, wouldn't you? Any father would. Of course, but within the bounds of the law. The bounds of the law, Cross repeated thoughtfully. She walked to the defense table and picked up a thick folder. Your Honor, I'd like to present Defense Exhibit A, financial records from the Harrison Family Trust. Martinez shot to her feet. Objection. Relevance? Goes to bias, Your Honor. The witness's credibility is at issue. Judge Morrison frowned. I'll allow it, but keep it brief, Ms. Cross. Cross opened the folder with theatrical precision. Judge Harrison, isn't it true that your family trust has been under investigation by the IRS for tax evasion for the past 18 months? My blood went cold. Judge Harrison's face flushed, but his voice remained steady. That's a civil matter completely unrelated to this case. Is it? Because according to these documents, your trust owes the federal government approximately $4 million in back taxes and penalties. That's quite a financial burden for someone on a judge's salary. I fail to see how my personal tax situation relates to Mr. Blackwood's criminal activities. Cross smiled like a shark scenting blood. It relates because Richard Blackwood's pension fund investigation was scheduled to uncover some very interesting offshore account connections. Accounts that both your trust and his shell companies have been using for years. The courtroom erupted. Martinez was shouting objections, Judge Morrison was banging her gavel, and I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. Cross wasn't just defending Richard, she was implying that Judge Harrison had been complicit in the financial crimes all along. Judge Harrison, Cross continued over the chaos, isn't it true that you only turned against Richard Blackwood when you realized he was planning to expose your joint money laundering operation to save himself? That's absolutely false. Judge Harrison snapped, his composure finally cracking. Then explain why your signature appears on transfer authorizations for 6 different Cayman Heritage Holdings transactions over the past 3 years. As Cross held up document after document, I realized with growing horror that Richard's defense wasn't going to be about his innocence. It was going to be about dragging everyone else down with him, including the father Michael had just found and the man who'd tried to save our family. Richard was still playing his sick games, even from the defendant's chair. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Cross weighed the transfer documents like weapons. Judge Harrison sat frozen in the witness chair, his face pale as the implications of her accusations sank in. Richard watched from the defendant's table with the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Even facing life in prison, he was still finding ways to destroy the people who'd exposed him. Your Honor, Martinez said, standing slowly, I'd like to redirect. Judge Morrison nodded curtly. Proceed, but make it quick. This trial is about Mr. Blackwood's crimes, not the witness's finances. Martinez approached the witness stand with her own folder. Judge Harrison, Ms. Cross showed you transfer authorizations with your signature. Do you recognize these documents? Yes, Judge Harrison said quietly. They're forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Cross jumped up. Objection. The witness is not a handwriting expert. Sustained, but I'll allow him to explain his statement. Judge Harrison looked directly at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, 18 months ago the FBI asked me to participate in a sting operation against several offshore money laundering operations. My signature on those documents was part of that investigation. I was signing blank forms that were then used to trace illegal fund transfers. Martinez smiled. Your Honor, I'd like to present Prosecution Exhibit 47, the original FBI authorization for Judge Harrison's undercover participation in Operation Clean Slate. As Martinez handed the document to the judge, I saw Richard's confident expression crumble. Cross was frantically flipping through her notes, clearly caught off guard by this development. Judge Harrison, Martinez continued, can you explain to the jury what Operation Clean Slate was designed to accomplish? We were tracking a network of shell companies being used to launder money from various criminal enterprises, pension fraud, charity embezzlement, insurance fraud. The operation was designed to map the entire network by following the paper trail. And did Richard Blackwood's financial activities come to the attention of Operation Clean Slate? Yes. His companies were among the primary targets of our investigation. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Judge Harrison hadn't been Richard's accomplice, he'd been the federal agent orchestrating Richard's downfall from the very beginning. Cross's entire defense strategy had just backfired spectacularly. One final question, Judge Harrison, Martinez said. When you learned that Michael was your biological son, did that knowledge in any way compromise your commitment to bringing Richard Blackwood to justice? Judge Harrison's voice was steel. It strengthened it. Because I realized Richard hadn't just stolen money from strangers, he tried to murder my grandson to cover up his crimes. Cross's closing argument was desperate, rambling, and unconvincing. She tried to paint Richard as a tragic figure driven to extremes by financial pressure and family betrayal. But the evidence was overwhelming, recorded confessions, financial records, testimony from Caroline Webb about the murder conspiracy, and now proof that the FBI had been tracking Richard's crimes for over a year. Martinez's closing was surgical. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Blackwood didn't just steal money. He didn't just lie to his family. He planned to murder a 3-month-old baby to cover up his crimes. He destroyed his own son's marriage with false accusations. He terrorized innocent people to protect his stolen wealth. This isn't a case about financial desperation, it's about a man who decided other people's lives were worth less than his reputation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement of pension funds, guilty. On the charge of fraud involving children's charity funds, guilty. As the guilty verdicts rang out, Richard finally showed emotion. Not remorse, rage. Pure, burning hatred directed at everyone who'd refused to let him destroy our family for his greed. Judge Morrison sentenced him to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Walking out of that courthouse, Michael held James in one arm and wrapped his other around me. Judge Harrison, my son's real grandfather, walked beside us, finally free to build the relationship with his family that Richard had stolen 30 years ago. It's over, I whispered, barely believing it was true. No, Michael said, kissing the top of James's head. Now it's beginning.